I found my wedding dress hanging in the closet with another woman's perfume still clinging to the sleeve of my fiancé's jacket beside it, and that was the moment I understood that the man I was about to marry in 11 days had already given away the one thing I thought was only mine. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet kind of hope that rebuilds a life piece by piece, and in the idea that second chances can still mean something even after betrayal, then please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like mine deserve to be told to a family of people who still believe in second chances the way I once did. My name is Margaret Hollis, though everyone who has ever loved me calls me Maggie, and at 34 years old I had built a life that looked, from the outside, like something out of a magazine spread about young professional success. I worked as a senior architect at a mid-sized firm in Portland, Oregon, the kind of job that let me design libraries and community centers instead of just glass towers for people who already had everything, and I had spent 6 years of my life loving a man named Ethan Whitfield the way you love someone when you've decided, quietly and without fanfare, that this is simply how the rest of your life is going to look. Ethan was charming in that effortless way some men are, the kind of charm that made restaurant hostesses seat us faster and made his mother adore me before I'd even finished my first dinner at her table. He sold commercial real estate, he laughed loudly at his own jokes, and for most of those 6 years, I believed with my whole chest that he loved me the way I loved him. We got engaged on a Tuesday, which Ethan always found funny to tell people, because he said real love doesn't wait for a special occasion, it just shows up on an ordinary Tuesday and changes everything. He proposed in the kitchen of the apartment we shared, no big production, no crowd of onlookers filming for social media, just the two of us and a ring he'd saved for over 8 months, and I remember thinking that this was exactly the kind of unglamorous, honest moment I wanted to build a marriage on top of. We set the wedding date for the following September, a full 16 months out, because Ethan wanted time to save for a house down payment and I wanted time to plan the kind of wedding my mother, who had passed 3 years earlier from ovarian cancer, would have wanted to see, even though she wouldn't be there to see it. The 16 months passed the way engagement months do, full of cake tastings and venue deposits and arguments about whether his cousin's band could play at the reception, and somewhere in the busy middle of all that planning, I stopped looking closely at Ethan the way you stop noticing the exact shade of blue in a room you walk through every single day. That's the thing nobody tells you about long relationships. You stop seeing the person and start seeing the shape of them, the outline you've memorized, and you fill in the details from memory instead of from what's actually standing in front of you. If I had been looking closely, really looking, in those last few months before the wedding, I might have noticed the way Ethan started taking his phone into the bathroom, or the way he'd laugh a half-second too late at things I said, like he was catching up from somewhere far away. But I wasn't looking. I was choosing fabric swatches and arguing with a florist about whether peonies would even be in season. 11 days before our wedding, I came home early from what was supposed to be a full day of final walkthroughs at the venue, because the coordinator had a family emergency and cancelled on me with barely an hour's notice. I remember standing in the parking lot of that beautiful old converted barn we'd booked, feeling almost relieved to have an unexpected free afternoon, thinking I might surprise Ethan with lunch, maybe even convince him to take off work early so we could just be quiet together for once, away from seating charts and vendor contracts. That small, ordinary decision to come home early is the hinge on which the rest of my life turned, and I think about that often, how the biggest changes in a person's story sometimes arrive disguised as the smallest inconveniences. I let myself into our apartment a little after 1 in the afternoon, and I heard the shower running, which struck me as strange because Ethan had left for work that morning already showered and dressed for a client meeting he said would run until at least 4. I called his name once, twice, got no answer over the sound of the water, and walked toward our bedroom to change out of my heels, and that's when I saw it hanging over the back of our reading chair, a woman's blouse, pale yellow, definitely not mine, definitely not left behind by any friend or sister who'd visited, because I don't own a single friend who wears a blouse that expensive and I certainly don't have a sister. Next to it, tossed carelessly on the floor like it had been shed in a hurry, was Ethan's jacket, the navy one he wore to important meetings, and when I picked it up out of some instinct I still don't fully understand, the collar carried a perfume that was not mine, sweet and floral in a way that made my stomach drop before my brain had even finished processing what I was looking at. I stood frozen in the doorway of my own bedroom while the shower kept running on the other side of the wall, and I want to tell you honestly that in that moment I did not scream, I did not cry, I did not do any of the things you might imagine a woman does when she discovers her fiancé has brought another woman into their shared home 11 days before their wedding. I felt, instead, a strange and terrible calm settle over me, the kind of calm I imagine soldiers describe feeling in the middle of chaos, where your body simply decides that survival requires clarity, not emotion. I walked to the closet, and there, exactly where I'd left it 2 weeks earlier after the final fitting, hung my wedding dress in its garment bag, ivory silk, hand-beaded bodice, the dress my mother had seen sketches of before she died and told me she could already picture me in. I unzipped the bag halfway, just enough to touch the fabric, and I thought, with a clarity that shocked even me, that I was looking at the last few threads of a life I had built on a foundation that had apparently never been solid at all. The bathroom door opened before I'd decided what to do next, and Ethan walked out in a towel, steam curling behind him, and behind him, wrapped in one of our good towels, the ones my mother had given us as an engagement gift, came a woman I recognized instantly and with a fresh wave of nausea as Priya Fenwick. No wait, I need to be careful here because I promised myself I'd remember every detail honestly. And her name was actually Charlotte Reyes, a colleague from Ethan's office who had come to our engagement party 8 months earlier and hugged me warmly and told me how lucky I was. Ethan's face did something I will never forget as long as I live, a complete collapse of every confident, charming expression he'd ever worn around me, replaced by pure animal panic, the look of a man watching the walls of his carefully constructed life fall in around him in real time. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because I think people expect these stories to involve screaming and thrown objects and dramatic exits, and maybe for some people that's exactly what happens, and there's no shame in that kind of raw, honest reaction. But for me, something else happened. I looked at Charlotte, who had gone pale and was clutching that towel like it might protect her from what was coming, and I said, in a voice so steady it frightened me, that she should get dressed and let herself out, and that I would appreciate her never contacting me again. She left within 4 minutes, practically running past me with her yellow blouse bundled in her arms, not even fully dressed, and I stood in my living room with Ethan, who had wrapped himself in a robe and was already talking, already explaining, already doing the thing men do when they've been caught, which is to try to narrate their way backward out of the truth. He told me it meant nothing. He told me it had started only recently, some ridiculous number like 6 weeks, as though a shorter timeline made the betrayal smaller instead of simply adding a fresh layer of calculation to it, since 6 weeks meant he had been sleeping with Charlotte Reyes while we were choosing our wedding cake flavor, while we were writing our vows, while I was crying happy tears in a bridal shop dressing room with my Aunt Rosalind holding my hand and telling me my mother would be so proud. He told me he still wanted to marry me, that this was a mistake, a moment of weakness, that the wedding could still happen, that we could get through this together if I would just let him explain properly instead of standing there looking at him like a stranger. And I remember thinking, with a coldness that surprised me, that he had not once, in those first frantic minutes, actually apologized. He had explained, minimized, bargained, but he had not said the words "I'm sorry," and somehow that absence told me more about the shape of his character than the affair itself had. I left the apartment that afternoon and drove to my Aunt Rosalind's house on the other side of town, because she was the closest thing I had to a mother since my own mother passed, and I sat in her kitchen while she made tea neither of us drank and I told her everything in a voice that stayed remarkably steady until I got to the part about my wedding dress hanging in that closet, and then something in me finally broke open and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the week my mother died. Rosalind didn't say much. She's not a woman of many words, but she held my hand across that kitchen table for nearly 2 hours, and at some point, somewhere in the middle of my crying, she said something that I would turn over in my mind for the next 11 days like a stone I couldn't stop touching. She said, "Maggie, you don't have to cancel the wedding. You just have to decide what the wedding is actually for." I didn't understand what she meant that afternoon, and honestly I thought grief and exhaustion were making her speak in riddles, but over the next 3 days, as I moved through the mechanical business of unraveling a life, canceling the honeymoon flights, calling my father to tell him he wouldn't need to give a toast after all, drafting and deleting 100 different messages to send to the guest list. Her words kept surfacing. What was the wedding actually for? I had spent 16 months thinking the wedding was for Ethan and me, a celebration of a partnership I believed was solid, but as I sat with that question honestly, I realized the wedding, in my heart, had always been about something bigger than just the two of us. It had been for my mother's memory, for the promise I'd made her in the hospital that I would build a joyful, full life even after losing her. It had been for the community of people, my father, my aunt, my closest friends, my mother's old church family, who had shown up for me in every hard season of my life and who I had wanted, more than anything, to gather in one room and thank with a celebration of love and endurance. 6 days after I found Ethan and Charlotte together, I drove to the venue, that same converted barn with its exposed wooden beams and the big arched windows that let afternoon light pour across the reception floor like something out of a painting, and I sat down with the coordinator, a warm, sharp-eyed woman named Delphine Ashworth who had already heard through the wedding industry grapevine that something had gone wrong. I expected her to gently suggest canceling the deposit-forfeited event and moving on with my life quietly, and instead Delphine asked me a question that echoed my aunt's words so closely it gave me chills. She asked me what I actually wanted that day to mean now. And sitting in that empty barn, with the caterer's delivery trucks idling outside and the late morning sun slanting through those big windows, an idea took shape in my mind that felt less like a decision and more like something that had been waiting inside me to be discovered. I did not want to marry Ethan Whitfield. That part was clear and had been clear since the moment I saw that yellow blouse. But I did not want to lose the day itself, the gathering, the celebration, the chance to stand in front of everyone who loved me and mark this moment of my life as something other than pure loss. So I made a decision that surprised even Delphine, who had, by her own admission, seen every kind of wedding disaster in her 14 years in the business but never quite this. I told her I still wanted to hold the event on our original date, but I wanted to transform it into something else entirely, a celebration not of a marriage but of survival, of chosen family, of the community that had carried me through the hardest seasons of my life, culminating not in vows exchanged with a groom but in a different kind of ceremony altogether, one where I would stand up in that beautiful barn and formally, publicly commit myself to the next chapter of my own life, surrounded by the people who actually deserved a seat at that table. Word moved quickly through my circle once I started making calls, and I braced myself for pity, for awkward silences, for the particular flavor of sympathy that makes a wounded person feel smaller instead of stronger. What I got instead astonished me. My father, a quiet man of few words who had struggled to know what to say to me since my mother died, called me on the 4th night after the discovery and told me, in a voice thick with something I rarely heard from him, that he would be honored to walk me down that aisle for any reason I chose, that giving his daughter away to her own future was maybe an even greater honor than giving her away to a man. My closest friend since architecture school, a fiercely loyal woman named Beatrix Coleman who had never fully trusted Ethan and had kept that opinion to herself out of respect for my choices, cried on the phone and told me this was, in her words, the bravest thing she'd ever watched me do, and she immediately began organizing the bridesmaids, who were still very much on board, just now walking a different kind of aisle for a different kind of purpose. The 11 days between discovery and the original wedding date became, strangely, some of the most transformative days of my entire life. I did not spend them in bed crying, though I want to be honest and say there were mornings I couldn't get out from under the covers until noon, mornings when the smell of a certain shampoo in the grocery store aisle sent me straight back to that bathroom doorway and that shower running and that yellow blouse. Grief for a relationship you thought was permanent doesn't disappear just because you've made a brave decision about how to spend a Saturday afternoon. But alongside that grief, something else was growing, quiet and unglamorous, like a seed pushing up through hard soil. I began writing, late at night, in a journal my mother had given me years earlier that I'd never properly used, and what came out of me in those pages wasn't rage at Ethan, though there was some of that too, but something closer to a letter to myself, an accounting of every year I'd spent making myself smaller to fit into a partnership that, looking back honestly, had already been shrinking me long before Charlotte Reyes ever entered the picture. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. Forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation, and it took me most of those 11 days to fully understand the difference. Ethan called me every day, sometimes multiple times, and on the third day he showed up at my aunt's house uninvited, standing on her porch in the late afternoon sun looking genuinely wrecked, hollow-eyed, unshaven, a version of himself I had honestly never seen before, always so put together, so confident. He told me he had ended things completely with Charlotte, that he had been in therapy twice already that week, which I later learned was true, that he understood if I never forgave him, but he needed me to know the affair had never been about a lack of love for me, it had been about his own fear, his own self-sabotage. Some deep unresolved wound about his parents' divorce when he was 9 that he had never properly dealt with and had instead let curdle into this catastrophic betrayal 11 days before he was supposed to promise me forever. I listened to him on that porch, and I want to be honest that some part of me, the part that had loved him for 6 years and had pictured a whole future built around him, wanted desperately to believe that people can change quickly and completely under the pressure of losing everything. But I had spent those days writing in my mother's journal, and one of the things I'd written, in the middle of a Tuesday night I couldn't sleep through, was this line that I still think about: love that requires you to catch someone in the act before they'll tell you the truth is not the same as love that tells you the truth because it respects you enough to. I told Ethan, standing on that porch, that I believed his pain was real, that I even believed his remorse was real, but that believing someone's pain is real is not the same as believing you owe them a second chance at the exact same role in your life. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it, because carrying that particular weight of hatred for the rest of my life sounded like its own kind of prison, but that forgiveness was a gift I was giving myself, not a door I was reopening for him. He cried on that porch in a way I had genuinely never seen him cry before, and I felt something close to compassion for him even as I closed the door, gently but completely, on the future we had planned together. The days kept moving, the way days do even when you feel like the world should pause to acknowledge how much has changed. Delphine and I worked together to reshape the entire event, and I discovered in that process a strange, unexpected joy, the joy of building something from the wreckage of something else, which felt, in its own way, like a metaphor for what I was doing with my whole life. We kept the flowers, because peonies had come into season right on schedule, and it felt wasteful and a little bit spiteful toward my own joy to let them go to waste over Ethan's mistakes. We kept the string quartet, though we changed the song list, cutting the songs that had once been our songs, and replacing them with pieces my mother used to hum around the house when I was a child, pieces that felt like they belonged to me long before Ethan Whitfield ever existed. We kept the guest list almost entirely intact, minus, obviously, Ethan's side of the family, though his mother, in a gesture that moved me more than I expected, sent me a private note that week telling me she was ashamed of her son and that she hoped I knew the years I'd spent as part of their family had meant something real to her regardless of how things ended. On the morning of what would have been my wedding day, I woke up at my Aunt Rosalind's house in the same guest room I'd slept in during difficult stretches of my childhood, and the September light came through the curtains in that particular golden way that only seems to happen a few times a year, and I lay in bed for a long moment simply breathing, feeling the strange mixture of grief and anticipation that I imagine must be close to what people feel on the morning of any major life threshold. A birth, a death, a beginning. Beatrix arrived at 9 with coffee and a box of pastries and immediately burst into tears when she saw me already awake, and we spent the morning together the way I had always imagined spending my wedding morning, except instead of doing my hair while talking about married life, we did my hair while she read aloud from a list of affirmations she'd apparently stayed up half the night writing for me, silly and sincere in equal measure. Things like "You are not the woman who got left, you are the woman who left first when it mattered most." I wore the dress. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I sat with the decision for days before I made it. My mother had seen sketches of that dress, had told me from her hospital bed that she could picture her daughter in it walking toward a whole life of happiness, and I decided, somewhere around day 9 of those 11 strange days, that the dress had never belonged to my marriage to Ethan in the first place. It belonged to my mother's hope for me. It belonged to the version of myself who deserved to be celebrated regardless of who was or wasn't standing at the other end of the aisle. So at 2 in the afternoon, under a sky so clear and blue it looked almost staged, I put on that ivory silk dress with its hand-beaded bodice, and I looked at myself in Rosalind's full-length mirror, and for the first time in 11 days I did not see a woman who had been betrayed. I saw a woman who was about to walk toward herself. The barn was full when we arrived, nearly 140 guests, every seat taken, and I remember standing at the back with my father, who had put on the same navy suit he'd bought for the original wedding and who took my arm with a gentleness that undid me a little, and he leaned over just before the doors opened and told me that your mother would be so proud of you today, not because of a wedding, but because of this. Because you knew the difference between the two. The string quartet began to play, not the processional we'd originally chosen but a piece my mother used to hum while she cooked dinner, something soft and unhurried, and the doors opened, and I walked down that same aisle I had planned to walk down as a bride, except this time toward a small platform where Delphine had set up not an altar but a simple wooden table with a single lit candle and a stack of blank cards. I had written something to say, though I'll admit I abandoned most of my notes the moment I stood up there and looked out at that room full of faces, my father's, Rosalind's, Beatrix's, my mother's old church friends who had shown up not knowing quite what to expect but had come anyway because they loved me, cousins and co-workers and neighbors who had all cleared their Saturday for a wedding and instead found themselves witnessing something harder to name. I told them, in a voice that shook only a little, that 11 days earlier I had discovered my fiancé's betrayal in the most painful way possible, and that I had spent every day since deciding what kind of woman I wanted to become in the aftermath of that discovery. I told them that I did not want to stand here today defined by what Ethan had done to me, but by what I had chosen to do in response, which was not revenge, and not bitterness, but a kind of fierce, deliberate hope. I told them that I was replacing my wedding not with anger but with a promise, a vow not to a husband but to myself and to every person in that room who had ever shown up for me without conditions, a vow that I would keep choosing joy even when life handed me every reason not to, that I would keep choosing to build rather than to merely survive, that I would keep believing in love, real love, the kind that tells the truth before it's caught, even after seeing exactly how badly it could go wrong. I asked each of them, the way you might ask guests to sign a wedding book, to write on those blank cards one piece of hope they wanted to offer me for the years ahead, and while the quartet played something quiet, nearly 140 people filed past that little wooden table and left me their handwriting, their blessings, their small fierce declarations that I was loved and that this day, however different from what everyone had expected, was still worth celebrating. My father's card, which I still keep in a frame in my office, simply said your mother is not gone from this room, I promise you that. Beatrix's card made me laugh out loud in the middle of my own ceremony, something about how Ethan Whitfield was going to spend the rest of his life explaining to strangers why he wasn't at his own wedding, which was exactly the kind of dark, loyal humor I needed in that moment. If this part of my story is resonating with you, if you've ever had to rebuild something out of the wreckage of a broken promise, I want to ask you to pause for just a moment and leave a comment about what forgiveness or second chances have meant in your own life, because I read every single comment on our channel, and I think stories like this get stronger every time we share our own version of them with each other. The reception that followed was unlike anything I could have planned in advance, because grief and joy sat together at every table in a way that felt honest instead of forced. My father gave the toast he'd originally prepared for Ethan, reworked in the 2 days prior into something entirely about me, about the little girl who used to redesign her dollhouse floor plans before she was even in kindergarten, about the young woman who chose a career built on the idea that broken things could be reimagined into something beautiful and functional again, and about the grown woman standing in front of everyone that day who had just proven, in the most painful circumstances imaginable, that she had the courage to apply that same philosophy to her own life. There wasn't a dry eye at the head table, and even the caterers, who Delphine told me later had seen plenty of unconventional weddings but never quite one like this, kept coming over throughout the afternoon to tell me how moved they were. I danced that afternoon, in full daylight, under the open barn doors where the September sun slanted gold across the wooden floor, first with my father to a song my mother used to play in the kitchen, and then with nearly every person in that room who wanted a turn, aunts and cousins and old family friends who each seemed to want a private moment to tell me how proud they were, how brave they thought this decision was, how much it meant to witness someone choose herself so completely in the wreckage of betrayal instead of collapsing under its weight. I want to be honest that there were moments that afternoon when grief still surfaced, a song that had once meant something to Ethan and me playing briefly before I asked the quartet to switch, a moment when I caught myself looking toward the door out of some old habit, expecting him to walk in the way he always used to walk into rooms, loud and easy and certain of his welcome. But those moments passed quickly, folded back into the larger current of the day, which was, against every odd, a genuinely joyful one. In the weeks that followed what I now simply call my becoming day, because Beatrix started calling it that and it stuck, I moved out of the apartment I'd shared with Ethan and into a small rental house closer to my aunt, a modest place with a garden that had been badly neglected by the previous tenants and that I spent that entire fall slowly bringing back to life, which felt like exactly the kind of metaphor I needed to physically enact with my own two hands. I threw myself back into work, and something shifted there too. Some new confidence that my colleagues noticed before I fully understood it myself, a willingness to advocate for my own design ideas in meetings where I'd previously deferred, a boldness that I think had been buried under years of quietly shrinking myself to keep a fragile peace at home. Within 4 months I was leading my first major project independently, a community library renovation in a historic neighborhood, and I remember standing in that half-finished building one afternoon, watching light pour through a newly restored skylight, thinking that I had spent my whole career designing spaces for other people's transformations without fully understanding I was capable of the same kind of rebuild in my own life. I heard from Ethan a handful of times over the following year, always respectful, always careful, an email around the holidays, a brief message when a mutual friend got married and he wanted to make sure it wouldn't be awkward for me to attend. I never responded with anger, but I never responded with an opening either, and eventually the messages tapered off entirely, which felt less like an ending and more like a door quietly, permanently closing on its own, exactly the way I'd wanted it to. I heard through the grapevine of our overlapping social circle, nearly 2 years later, that he and Charlotte Reyes had eventually gotten together properly and then, less than a year after that, had ended things as well, and I want to be honest that I felt no satisfaction in that news, only a kind of tired sadness for everyone involved, including myself for the years I'd spent building a future on a foundation that had apparently never been steady to begin with. What I want you to understand, if you've made it this far into my story, is that the version of myself who stood in that barn 18 months ago, delivering a ceremony to a room full of people instead of vows to a man, is not the same woman writing this today. I did not simply survive Ethan's betrayal. I let it become the strange, painful hinge on which I discovered exactly how much love was already present in my life, waiting patiently in the people who had shown up for me my whole life without ever needing a wedding invitation to do it. My father and I are closer now than we've been since before my mother died, partly because that porch conversation and that walk down the aisle cracked something open between us that grief alone had never quite managed to. Beatrix and I still laugh about her handwritten card from that day, which she has since had turned into a small framed print that hangs in my kitchen as a reminder that even in my darkest week, someone I loved was fierce enough to make jokes about my ex-fiancé's wasted wedding suit. I started dating again about a year after that day, slowly, carefully, and I want to be honest that it took real, deliberate work to unlearn some of the smallness I'd folded myself into during those 6 years with Ethan, work that involved a good therapist and a lot of uncomfortable, honest conversations with myself in that same journal my mother had given me. I'm seeing someone now, a thoughtful, steady man named Julian who I met through the library project, who has never once made me feel like I needed to shrink any part of myself to be loved properly, and while I'm not rushing toward any particular ending with him, I find myself, for the first time in years, genuinely curious and unafraid about what the future might hold, which feels like its own kind of quiet miracle after everything. If this story has touched something in you today, if you've ever had to find the courage to rebuild a celebration, a relationship, or even just a single ordinary day out of something that was falling apart in your hands, I want to ask you to take a moment and leave a comment about what forgiveness and second chances have meant in your own life, because I believe our community grows stronger every single time we're honest with each other about the hardest chapters we've lived through. And if this story touched your heart even a little, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. I think often about that afternoon in the parking lot of the venue, the ordinary decision to come home early that changed the entire shape of my life, and I no longer think of it as the worst day of my story, though for a long time I did. I think of it now as the day the truth finally arrived, uninvited and devastating, but honest, and honesty, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted, is always, eventually, a kind of mercy. I did not marry Ethan Whitfield on that September afternoon, but I made a promise that day that I have kept faithfully in every season since, a promise to myself that no love, no partnership, no version of belonging is ever worth the price of disappearing from your own life. My mother used to tell me, long before she got sick, that the bravest thing a person can do is build something beautiful out of what's true, even when what's true is painful, and I think about that wisdom every single day now, in the garden I planted outside my little rental house, in the buildings I design for other people's futures, in the quiet, steady, unglamorous work of becoming a woman I am genuinely proud to be. I did not lose my wedding day. I simply gave it back to myself, and it turned out to be the best decision I ever made.